Pete, it's
me.
not you. It's not
Yes.
me either. All right. Do you want to take it from the top?
Sure.
And you give an abbreviated, I mean, folks can see the slides. We've also been joined by Councilman Z. Cohen for the first district. So you don't
Okay.
you don't have to like read the whole thing here. I don't want
All right, but the introductions at least, yep. Good evening, Councilman Costello and members of the committee. My name is Pete Little. I'm Executive Director with the Parking Authority. With me today is Sandra Downs, our Chief Financial Officer. I was about to give you two titles, yeah. We're a small, lean quasi-agency with 51 team members tasked with a range of management of the city's parking assets and programs, including the parking meter program, the city's residential reserved disabled parking program, the residential permit parking program, the city's valet regulations program. We also operate 12 city-owned or operated parking garages and 20 parking lots with over 9,000 spaces. We lead the city's efforts to bring more publicly accessible electric vehicle charging stations to the city, and our parking planning division collects and analyzes data to develop parking plans for neighborhoods throughout the city. A few of our goals, as listed on the slide here, we'll be installing new parking access and revenue control equipment at the city garages within this calendar year. That'll be complete. We'll be implementing a new residential permit parking online system that'll enable the expansion of virtual permit parking throughout the city here. That will be complete within the next several months, the implementation of the new system. And then over the course of the next year, we'll be inviting other residential permit parking areas to transition to virtual permit parking. We'll also be introducing multiple mobile payment apps and a text-to-pay option at parking meters later this calendar year. So this service is supported by the Parking Enterprise Fund and the Parking Management Fund. Revenues from parking garages, parking meters, parking permits, parking citations, and parking taxes get collected in these funds. And after deducting expenses for operations and the payment of debt service on the city's garages, surplus revenue is transferred to the city's general fund. The recommended budget reduces funding by $1.1 million for this coming fiscal year, due mostly to a reduction in debt service costs. So we have a few highlighted performance measures. The first is the number of permits distributed. During the pandemic, enforcement of residential permit parking restrictions was suspended for a time, and fewer residents acquired permits as a result of that. But with the addition of some new residential permit parking areas and the expansion of some existing areas, along with the resumed and enhanced residential permit parking enforcement, we expect to distribute an increasing number of permits.
Pause you right there.
Yep.
I've been waiting for this. This is a perfect example. Laura, this is what I've been talking about the performance measures, which are entirely useless. They are no offense to you, everyone's good here, but this is like the performance measure of the number of calls that the 311 center takes. The number of calls they take are the number of calls that come in. The number of RPP permits that are issued is the number of RPP subscribers in the 52 areas?
Yes.
51? 52?
52.
52, very good. I don't know how we come up with a more meaningful performance metric, because I suspect this year they're going to issue 37,642 decals and visitor permits, because that's how many subscribers there are. Any thoughts on what might be a more meaningful metric here? Like, I can't think of one with RPP. Yeah. Although I spend like an inordinate amount of time dealing with RPP in my 14 areas.
Well, we are beginning to collect some data that I think would be more meaningful to your point here. We're actually conducting a survey right now of residents in RPP areas, asking them how far away they have to park their vehicles, weekdays, weekends, and evenings.
Number of survey responses as a performance measure?
A number of survey, how many have we received so far, do you mean?
Well, no, I was just suggesting that, again, if someone has to park 5 blocks from their house, that's not an indication of whether or not parking authority has done its job. Parking authority's job in the instance of, or in the example of RPP, your job is to administer the program and issue passes and decals, and then special passes for businesses and churches that have those in the PMPs. So I don't.
Yeah, Pete and I had a really good conversation about the parking authority metrics actually when we were preparing for tonight's hearing. You'll notice if you look at this service in the budget book, there's a couple of other measures that we printed in the budget book that were missing data. Part of the issue there were a couple of measures we used to track for parking authority where data is no longer being tracked. So I know there was one metric where they were reliant on information from the police department that was no longer being tracked. We also used to do the community survey, but that's been on pause for a number of years, although we are looking at getting that started again this summer. What I will say about performance measures in general, Chairman, is that I share your perspective. When we started publishing performance metrics in the budget book back in the fiscal 11 budget, the intent of including performance metrics as part of the discussion around the budget was to tell us how much do we do, how well do we do it, and is anybody better off? And I think as we've tried to come up with metrics and as we've gone through different iterations, we haven't always hit the mark in terms of coming up with a set of a good, 3 to 5 items that answer those questions. I think we made some progress with the performance plans in terms of trying to accomplish the goal of having a comprehensive set of metrics that are used, both from a performance review standpoint as well as from the budget planning standpoint. But where I want to see us grow and where, I'm partnering with Steve Sharkey and OPI and under the leadership of City Administrator Leach, is really taking our performance plans to the next level where they're oriented around, okay, what's the goal of this service? And so I think if we are talking in the context of parking management, Pete and his team, if they were orienting around this, okay, why do we exist for the residents of the city of Baltimore? I think that logic exercise would result in more meaningful metrics that we would be able to put before this body on an annual basis in the budget. So what I can say is, I ask for continued patience as we try to get this right, because I know that, especially just listening to the second year of participating in these hearings and having participated in my former service with the City of Baltimore, I know that these metrics are incredibly important to how we deliberate around the budget. And I know we have to keep getting better in terms of providing something that's more meaningful.
It sounds like a work in progress, and I'm
Yes.
satisfied with that answer.
And if I could just add, really the goal of residential permit parking programs is to create availability of parking for the residents who live in those areas. So that's what we need to somehow try to measure. It's going to be a little bit of a challenge, but I think, working with finance, also with Department of Transportation, we can figure out ways to measure that, and whether it's that availability is increasing or decreasing, and what may be the issues.
Yeah, one last note. I don't know that you have a terrible amount of control over availability and turnover within the confines of what's signed for RPP. Mm-hmm. So again, I'm struggling with what's a very meaningful performance measure. Maybe there isn't one, but I defer to our performance measure expert.
Yeah, it's funny because Laura and I actually were working on this stuff back in 2012 because we had a lot of those very same questions. And she's spot on. You really have to think about what is the whole purpose of the parking authority and what exactly they're trying to accomplish. And I think it depends It depends on each of the different functions. And so, when you're working in a residential area, there's a balance. You want there to be parking spots available, but you don't want to have too many open spaces. And so there's a balance there as well. And also for our parking garages, there's another balance there as well. You don't want to have too many parking garages such that you don't have a certain capacity filled. You want to make sure that the supply meets the demand. So, in thinking about those pieces, I don't know if we have any studies about, or if we do like every couple of years, some sort of study on demand to understand what needs we have based on transit, based on events, based on other sort of space that brings drivers into the city to meet those demands. But that might be how I would look at it. I don't have the answers here, but that's how I would look at it if we were trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and I was just thinking the money that Senator Ferguson and I got for you back in 2017 for the Peninsula parking study.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any opportunity to look at parking counts after the once you move into the 0 hour tolerance phase for specific RPP areas. So Area 9 and Federal Hill, I think that starts at 6 p.m. So after 6 p.m., looking at utilization of metered spaces by vehicles that actually have the RPP decal for that area. But anyway, I digress. But thank you all for the input and what was at least a meaningful conversation. I appreciate it, and sorry for interrupting, Pete. Back to you.
Well, the other measure that we have listed here is the revenue per space at our off-street parking facilities, which has been growing post-pandemic, and we expect to continue to grow slowly but steadily. And that concludes my presentation. So,
Shamir is doing an outstanding job.
thank you.
You're welcome. Please pass that along.
We've got a really good team. Yep.
Conway? Cohen? McCray? Ramos?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was curious about how how your office is working with DOT on the enforcement side. I read in the budget that there's going to be a significant allocation to parking enforcement, which is not you, it's DOT, for license plate readers. Right. And so I would imagine that the list from the RPP would have to come to parking enforcement so that they know what license plates to look for. That's how you're going to end up doing that, and when is that going to take place?
It'll start early on the next fiscal year, and this really sort of dovetails with one of the goals that we have for this year, and that's the implementation of the new residential permit parking online system, whereby more residential permit parking areas are going to be able to transition to that virtual permit parking where the license plate becomes your permit to be able to park in that area. As other areas transition to it, and including those two areas that already have virtual permit parking, it's going to enable that enforcement with vehicle-mounted license plate recognition camera systems, which will now allow for then more efficient enforcement. So we're going to be piloting that this year, coordinating with Department of Transportation to do that and to roll it out into those areas as they transition to virtual permit parking.
How would that work with the visitor passes?
The households are going to be able to register their visitors either online or via an app or via a toll-free number. So for instance, if my mom were coming to visit on Sunday from noon to midnight, I'd be able to right now put her license plate into the system as a visitor using that virtual visitor permit for that period of time. And then when she comes to park, that information will be transferred right over to, well, it already exists in parking enforcement software as well too, so that they would know that she's registered as a visitor parked for that period of time.
So I'm an elder that doesn't have a phone to use for the online system, or I have, I don't have access to the internet, and I have a visitor coming, and I have a parking pass. How's that going to work for people who do not have access to online system?
Well, there's the toll-free number that they can call from either a landline or from a cell phone, any phone. They'll be able to call, present their user ID number and their password, and then be able to register their visitors online. And it's a
Great.
24/7, 365 toll-free number, so they'd be able to make that reservation at any time.
Well, hopefully we'll be doing a lot of marketing and information about this,
Yep.
so that people know to keep the toll-free number on the refrigerator, so that they can, maybe magnets or something. I mean, I'm just making this up, but you know what I mean? It's like,
Oh,
we've
yeah.
got to do that marketing system to make sure that people don't get tickets when they actually were trying to follow what to do, and then, they didn't have that. So do you have that programmed into your budget this year to be able to
Yes,
to
we
do
do.
that?
Yep. We've already sent some mailings out as well too, but we're going to allow each residential permit parking area to decide whether they want to go to virtual permit parking or stay with
okay.
the hard permits as well too. So some areas may decide to just stick with the hard permits, and they'll be able to do so. Others will be able to transition, but that was part of the reason why we had the pilot program, was to figure out, because Ridgely's Delight and Riverside, the two pilot areas, they have older residents as well too, and folks who don't have online access or computers. So wanted to make sure that all these systems worked, that we figured out, how it was best to communicate, how to use the system as well too, and we're able to do that with the pilot program, so that now expanding it will be made easier. But yeah, that's built into our budget also.
Great, okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Pete, I'm going to take a moment of privilege here. I don't normally do this. I got an email from one of our Group 1 parking garage operators about some business with the Wage Commission. Are you familiar with this?
Yes.
Are we going to be able to resolve this?
We'll see. We'll be working with them and with the Wage Commission as well too. Yep, it'll be resolved one
'Cause
way or
this
another.
Seems like they've done everything by the book here.
Yeah, they supplied all of the wage information to us on a regular basis, so it might be a
70
technicality that we have to work through, or it might be an issue, so.
$78,000 seems like an aggressive penalty for not filing a report.
Yeah.
Even though once the reports were filed, it was clear that they had done everything right. Faith, can I send this one to you? Outstanding. Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right. Ramos, you're good. Dorsey?
Thanks. For each permit parking area, do we have a count of the number of on-street parking spaces that exist within the permit area?
No, not currently.
You're talking about RPP areas?
Actual parking spaces,
Yeah, actual parking
Some
spaces.
RPP liaisons have conducted, I can tell you when I was a neighborhood president, I walked the whole area and we counted out 18-foot stripes and the number of spaces in an area. So some community groups have done that. It is not scientific, it is not exact, it is probably incorrect.
Changes from week to week,
Changes,
depending
yeah.
on daylighting and
New
other spaces taken. Yep.
Daylighting, handicap reserve, all that, but no, that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, that would seem like a basic necessity for managing parking, knowing what you're managing, right? I mean, it's called parking management, right? If you're managing the parking and RPP is the tool that's being used to manage it, how can you manage it properly if you don't know how much you've got to manage?
It's just something that we've never collected at the end of the day, and you know, we could, I'm not sure to what effect that would be or what we would use it for necessarily.
If I got $1 billion budget to manage, I got to know that I got $1 billion to manage. If I've got to manage parking, I got to know how much parking there is that I've got to manage. Right? Look, if anybody's here and wants to know about parking management, there's a wonderful book that everybody here, if you have any inclination to have an opinion about parking management at all, you should read The High Cost of Free Parking. It's the Bible on the subject, and I don't really think that you can properly understand urban ecosystems without understanding the principles that are in that book. I'll just say that. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And I take that as kind of a baseline understanding. But one of the things that's really clear when you start to look at it is most of parking policy is pseudoscience at best. Parking minimum requirements in zoning codes are like, there's absolutely no science behind them at all. They're just like kind of junk ideas that put private parking as this like undue priority that we pay a lot of costs for. I think that if we're going to continue to have, I just don't see how we can have a parking management strategy. And look, I don't like RPP. I'll just say that really clear. I think that RPP is like really, really problematic. I'd love, because if you can't tell me how many parking spaces you have in area 2 or whatever, then, I can't really make any assessment of what it means if you tell me how many permits you have for that area, right? If you've got 10,000 parking spaces and you've got 12,000 parking permits issued for that 10,000 space area, that tells me something about parking management. But if you've got 12,000 parking permits issued and I have zero idea how many parking spaces you have, I can't evaluate that. And so to me, that's a really important performance metric. That's a really important way of understanding whether our parking management strategy, if we can call it a strategy, is working. So I'd like to know how many parking spaces you've got. What would it take to get that?
Well, but I think it's important to note that parking, when it comes to, how many RPP areas do you have in your district?
1.
Okay, I got 14. I think it's really important to note that those RPP areas exist as a product of legislated policy by this body, not by Mr. Little. I'm not trying to come to his defense. I'm just saying that like those exist because either A, we legislate them, or B, because there's a process in Article 31, Section 10, if I'm not mistaken, which outlines the petition process for communities to kind of lead that effort to create them. So I guess the question is that necessarily a meaningful performance? I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just on the performance measure discussion right now that we were having before. Is that necessarily a meaningful performance measure for that agency's performance?
Yeah, okay. Not for the agency's performance necessarily, but for the performance of the overall parking management of the city, right? We task an agency with parking management for the city. And yes, it exists because our predecessors made it so, right? Our predecessors, I'm going to venture to say, did not read The High Cost of Free Parking or really study the subject any more than land use planners of the 20th century when they came up with the idea of things like parking minimum requirements that are regarded today as junk science, just like pseudoscience. There's just nothing underlying it except for vibes. And so, I think that as a member of this body, if I want to be able to evaluate the performance of the city of Baltimore's parking management strategy, I need to be able to evaluate that on the basis of understanding what we're working with. And so I'm asking the parking authority, what would it take you guys to come up with an inventory of the number of parking spaces in each of the parking areas, the residential parking permit areas?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question right now, but we can get it for you. We can find out what the cost would be.
How long would it take you to come up with that?
To come up with the cost,
Yeah,
a month,
okay, I'll take a month.
might be an estimate as well too, but yep,
Thank you.
sure.
Yeah, can you repeat the request, Councilman, just for clarity and for record keeping?
It's May 24th by June 24th for the parking authority to tell us how much money it's going to cost for them to figure out how many parking spaces exist within the RPP managed areas in the city. Broken down by zone preferably.
The cost broken down by zone?
No, I mean like how many spaces you've got in each zone,
Oh, yeah,
not just one lump sum.
sure.
I just want to be clear on the request. So are you asking how much it would cost to determine how many spaces? So this is an assessment? Okay, I just want to make sure I'm following.
An assessment of an assessment?
Got it.
You want to know how much it's going to cost for a parking authority if they were to go out and conduct a count of how many on-street spaces exist within all 52 areas, correct?
I mean, look, I want the count, but what I'm hearing here is the parking authority has no idea what it would take to get a count. So I guess
So there-
I got no choice here but to ask, what's it gonna take? Tell me what it's gonna take to get,
So what you could do, one thought, since we're here, one thought is what we could do, Pete, and you can let me know if you think this is feasible, and Laura, I would love your feedback on this as well. We can look at the number of residential permits that we've given out. We can go look at the average size of a parking space and then back into a number based off of, I mean, it's not science. It's,
Yeah,
I mean, that's not,
That wouldn't work.
Okay.
It's exponentially more complicated than that, but yeah,
yes.
no, I appreciate the.
you gotta do a foot on the ground, boots on the
It
ground.
requires manual.
Okay.
And then
You gotta
got
measure it.
You got curb cuts.
Right.
Yeah,
I
it's
hear
You have
just
to
a nightmare.
assess each block, determine, yeah, the actual parkable space on each block, divide it by
So
the
we need to
standard
hire a
size of
parking engineer?
a parking space, yeah.
Got it.
And, yep.
Oh, go ahead, jump in, let's talk this out, guys.
Right. So, if you have a GIS analyst, if you have a GIS analyst, you can probably measure each block within the RPPs and
However-
divide.
However.
Now,
you
it's not
can't
gonna be
do that
perfect.
Because DOT does not
No,
have an.
We
DOT
have, well, go ahead, you repeat what you were gonna say.
No, I want to be proven wrong. You go ahead.
Well, I don't, so what I was going to offer is DOT has, what is the system called? The Street View system.
City Works.
See,
Based on
No, not
ArcGIS.
CityWorks, no,
yeah.
the Street View system. Yes, yes, where they have the one, so one time a year, we have the system. Do you recall the name of it, council member?
But
I mean, all the
Okay.
city view stuff is built on ArcGIS, which is an Esri-based system.
We bought another system.
But the problem with that is you don't have curb cuts in that system.
So the
Right.
system that I'm talking about, annually, we send out, DOT goes out, or there's we use technology where we go out throughout the city, one time each year, and it's like our own Google Maps. So we have a view of every street in the city taken at a point.
Honest to God, if that's a thing that we have, I want to know about
Yes.
it. Because how long have we had this?
RPP?
We've purchased it, we've gotten it since I've started with the city. This was something that came up under CA Leach's predecessor.
I was
I'm
gonna
sorry,
say
so how long have we had
R-
this?
RPP's been around since
No,
Mary
not
Pat Clark.
RPP. I'm sorry, I'm gonna be quiet.
CAO. How long have we had whatever it is you're talking about?
We've had it for over a year, maybe going on 2, and a part of the reason why I'm as familiar with this system is because we met with the folks from Detroit and Bloomberg because they wanted us to use the system that Detroit has, where they actually put cameras on the front of buses, and that's how they're able to look at the street map throughout the city. And DOT said they already had a system, which they had procured previously. Mhm.
Is that the system that records the condition of the road? I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yes, and I cannot think of the name of it.
I can't remember the name either. We've had it for longer than a year. We've been doing that for a while, but I don't know if that would tell you the curb information.
It might not.
Yeah.
But just as we're talking this through, thinking about the tools we currently have at our disposal that might be able to assist with this. And that's
Faith,
one.
this is
I think you need a manual,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Yep.
Pete, I mean, you're the parking expert. I'm
Well, we'll
assuming
certainly-
we need a manual, or is there tools?
We'll work with DOT as well, too, if they have some sort of mapping currently that, also provides the curb cuts and the other parking restrictions, and, we can get a pretty good number based on that, then that would certainly save time. So we'll talk with them about it, and if they don't, then we'll take a look at what it would cost to do the manual survey.
The system is called Cyclomedia.
Can you spell that, please? Spell it. Media. Thank you. Cyclomedia. Okay. Can you ask DOT to brief me on, I'd like a demonstration of what this is? Yes. Thank you. Regardless, it's May 24th. By June 24th, you're going to tell me what it's going to take to get this done. Cool.
Estimate. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is about the change in the budget to funding regarding parking management dollars. So we saw a $1 million decrease there, and an increase in funding by about $2 million for parking enforcement. In that sort of balance between parking enforcement and parking management, how do you guys think about that? I mean, you guys don't do parking enforcement.
No, that's Department of Transportation. Yeah.
But it's certainly important for RPP, isn't it?
It's important for that and our parking meter program. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious how we think about that sort of coordination and planning between the two, and do we have the right balance of enforcement in the management and also the specifically management of spots? I'm curious how you guys think about that.
And Councilman, just before Pete jumps in on his perspective on that, part of the issue in terms of the decrease on the management side and the increase on the enforcement side, on the management side, we've retired a batch of debt service. So $1 million of the savings there is from some debt service coming off the books. And then a portion of that increase that you're seeing over on the parking enforcement side is the purchase of the technology that we had to add to the budget for the license plate
The new
readers.
RPP readers.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
But certainly there's a perspective in terms of where we invest on one side or the other.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
So yeah, in my 20 years with the Parking Authority here, we've always coordinated closely with Department of Transportation with the Safety Division, which oversees parking enforcement and traffic enforcement. They're a combined unit right now. And, we understand that they've had their challenges recruiting folks into those positions. It's a difficult position. It's been a challenge as well, too. So part of what we've been doing and working with them is to help them to try to find ways to do the job more efficiently so that if they can't be fully staffed, they can do the job more efficiently with fewer people. So that was, as a result of that, is this pilot program that we're taking a look at of enforcement using the vehicle-mounted license plate recognition systems in those areas, residential permit parking areas that switch to virtual permit parking. We expect that that will allow for enforcement there to be a lot more efficient, and we'll continue to work with them to figure out how to become more efficient and work with what they're able to have in terms of manpower.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Colin?
Hey, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Pete. It's good to see you.
Thanks.
Madam City Administrator. Interested in, and this is sort of a part U, part DOT question, but the ratio of revenue for RPP versus metered versus garage. And then I'm also really interested, to my colleague's previous question, in the ratio of staff that's associated with enforcement. That obviously is the DOT part of the question, but I'm just curious about how much revenue we're collecting from the different streams versus when we are going out and enforcing, where that enforcement muscle is going toward. And I ask in part, this is something Councilman Dorsey has talked a lot about, but I've seen as well in my district sort of that the lack of enforcement in particular areas drives a lot of frustration, or the lack of consistency. Again, not a parking authority problem, really more of a DOT problem, but it's all of our problem. And so I'm just curious how the money comes in and then how we allocate for enforcement.
Yeah, I can certainly get you the revenue figures for each of those programs that we operate for the city. I mean, just generally, residential permit parking brings in about $500,000 a year in revenue from the permit sales. Parking meters brings in between $10 and $11 million annually. And at the garages that we manage on behalf of the city, it's about $14 million a year in revenue. That's garages and parking lots.
Got it.
But I can get you more exact figures if you want them. But
Sure. And
those are
then, Madam Budget Chair and City Administrator, could we get just as close, I realize it's not going to be exact science, but as close to possible in terms of the allocation of where DOT is doing the enforcement, how much goes into each of those streams? I'm just very interested to know what they're bringing back.
Okay. And just in terms of, from a big picture, how the budget on parking revenues work. So we have two parking funds. We have the Parking Management Fund and the Parking Enterprise Fund. And those funds support the operations of the parking authority, and then they also support the operations of parking enforcement. And there's also some funding in revenue collections and finance for their role in terms of parking enforcement. And so what happens is every year we budget all of those expenditures, and then there is a balance left where the revenues exceed the cost of those programs, and that revenue then comes over to the city's general fund. So in fiscal 25, the transfer just from the Parking Management Fund to the city's general fund is 23 million. So that's about that's almost $6 million higher than fiscal 24. And a lot of that is because of some of these reforms that we're talking about with the license plate reader technology, as well as turning the late fees back on parking citations. But I can provide a follow-up that sort of gives you a flow of how those dollars work in terms of what services are funded by what funding source in terms of the two parking funds. And then we can certainly follow up with DOT to talk about their enforcement deployment.
Yeah, that would be great. Particularly just interested in how they're allocating their enforcement budget and where it's going to.
Oh, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
Are you, when you say deploying their resources, are you asking about areas of the city? Like, would you like a map?
Yeah, or yes, and a breakdown between RPP, metered, like just
got it.
interested in how much is going into one versus the other.
Got it, thank you.
I mean, I don't mean to speak for Department of Transportation, but that might be a little bit difficult for them to do because as TOs, the traffic enforcement officers, they have a combined role when they are out there being deployed, where they're doing parking meter enforcement and residential permit parking enforcement and may do some traffic control all within the same shift. So that might be difficult for them to break it down.
No, understood, but
Yeah.
I would assume there is some differentiation within each of the work streams, and I get it, there's going to be some overlap, no question, but I'm just sort of at a global, higher level interested in sort of how they're thinking about specifically where enforcement is being targeted, and again, this is somewhat channeling frustration of constituents, and I'm sure you hear this, though it's not your division, that folks will say, why aren't the TOs on my block at this time? And then in some cases you'll also have them say, why are they targeting my block at this time? So it's both sides of the coin, but I'm just kind of interested in how we as a city, as agencies, are thinking about it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can I tag on here? Thanks. Again, as I said, I think last week, Councilman Cohen, I can provide, I think, some deep insight on this. And I mean, I think that what you're pointing at is the fact that DOT is essentially not in any way mission-driven in the way that they conduct parking enforcement. And I can give you, I think, a pretty in-depth analysis of what actually goes on there and all of the operational problems that they're operating around, I think, just blindly. Let's spend some time with that. Sure. I can, because I've done my homework on this.
Sure. Thank you.
But I do think that if you were to look at the number of calls for service through the 311 system, because they're essentially driven, they have, I'm sure that they can provide some number of hours for proactive zone-based enforcement, and that is generally going to revolve around meters, or it's going to generally revolve around RPP, but that there are also just the calls for service that can be tallied up and, account for gone on arrival and all this, and I'm sure that they can assess an average response time or an average amount of time that's spent to respond to any given call, and then they can apportion out and tell you how many of those calls were for RPP versus some other form of parking violation. I do think it's possible. My question, though, and I'd never thought about this before, is my understanding from having looked into this in the past is that our rate for RPP permits for the issuance, what it costs to get an RPP permit, is based on some legal framework that says that the cost for the permits cannot exceed the cost to administer the program. And I think to Councilman Cohen's point, or in this kind of area, is this idea that, like, is parking enforcement of the RPP area considered essential to operating the program? Because if it is, the question I have is, are the fines issued by those citations from enforcement counted toward what we use to operate the program? Because if they are, I think that that's not what, that shouldn't be happening, right? The fines are a penalty for violating a law. And so I want to make sure that our RPP issuance fee covers not only the administration of the program through Parking Authority, but every dollar spent by the Department of Transportation or otherwise to conduct all of the enforcement. Can we get an analysis of that?
So what? I'm gonna start off on this one.
I can tell you this.
Or I
that-
got it. This is a rare instance that the councilman and I agree. I guess
It's not
they
as
say
rare as he would make it seem.
broken clock is right twice a day. I guess I'm the broken clock. So there was I'm just gonna opine here and then Pete can answer. I think that's a slippery slope in terms of the cost of administering it, because then it'd be very easy to get into, well, does the cost of the $502 fine that's issued for obstructing a fire hydrant, is that somehow tied into the operations of the Baltimore City Fire Department, and so on and so forth? And then we get into reserve handicap spaces, and is that somehow included in DOT's efforts under the, I'll just call it a consent decree or order from a judge? But there was an effort that when I was on the advisory board back in like 2011, to review tiered pricing for RPP permits and to look at whether or not you could increase the cost of the third and the fourth permit. And we looked at, I think, the top 100 or 110 cities in the country, population-wise, what other cities had done, and there were a number of cities, I don't know, 15 or 20 off the top of my head, which had a tiered pricing model. The important thing to note here is kind of twofold. One, the percentage of households that participate in the RPP program, the number of them that have 3 or more vehicles is extremely low. I want to say it's like 9%, and then the percentage of vehicles that have percentage of households that have 4 vehicles is 2% or 1%. But if you were to extend that tiered pricing model to lower than 3 vehicles, you do create a serious equity issue for residents to be able to participate in the program and have a fair shot like everyone else. If you were to, so it's just an important distinction that you would create that equity issue for residents who want to participate that might not normally be able to afford it, and if they can't afford it and can't participate, they are at a severe disadvantage.
I understand exactly what you're saying. I've had plenty of conversations about tiered pricing for RPP myself. It's not what I'm asking about, though. What I'm asking about is, let me try to be clear. Do we have an exact figure for what it costs Parking Authority to administer the RPP program? And then do we also have an exact figure for what DOT expends to do enforcement? And is the sum of those two numbers greater or less than what we bring in application fees for RPP permits? If the sum is greater than the RPP permits, then we need to raise the permit fees.
I can tell you that the permit fees that we collect, and I don't have an exact figure for how much we spend on RPP because, as I noted before, we manage lots of different programs, and so there are some shared costs that we'd have to break down somehow in order to apportion RPP. We have payroll costs and things like that, but there are other shared costs that we'd have to examine. So I don't have an exact figure right now, but I can tell you that the fees that we collect on the permits about equals our expense associated with administering the permit program.
Okay, well then that means that we need to know how much DOT expends, because if we consider the enforcement to be essential to the administration of the program, which I believe it is, you can't just have the program without enforcement, and so enforcement is essential to its administration. If what you're saying is that the fees equal your administrative costs, then we're also then shelling out for the enforcement without that being covered by the fees. And that's a problem if the fees are intended to cover the full cost of administration. So back to Councilman Cullen's point, we do really need to know what DOT spends to do enforcement on RPP. Thanks.
I've got one. I think that I'm the last one in the round, I think. Thank you. Thank you. I had a question about, I have a constituent who got a ticket in a stadium area without knowing that there was a stadium event. There's some signs in the downtown area and where the stadiums are that say, no parking during a stadium event. Now, they probably could have gotten on their phones to see whether there was a stadium event, but does the new sort of way you're thinking about doing the metered parking or any of the parking relative to, those stadium events also include information about the fact whether or not there is actually a stadium event happening?
Yeah, she must have gotten it in a residential permit parking area, I would imagine, because of the special restrictions for stadium events. The systems that we've developed are really for the residents and not for folks who may be driving into the area. So that would
The other
be,
thing to note is there's only 6 RPP areas that have stadium event enforcement towing. She's lucky she didn't get towed. But, it's hard to drive into, those areas are Area B, Pigtown, 41 Sharp Leadenhall, 8 Otterbein, 9 Federal Hill, 30 South Baltimore, and 5 Ridgely's Delight. It's really hard to drive into one of those areas while there's a stadium event and not know that there's a stadium event. I'm sorry she got the citation, but.
I understand, but, there's some people who are just focused on where they're going to, where they're going to park so that they can walk to go to dinner, as opposed to, oh my gosh, there's all these crowds, what are they here for? So I was just kind of curious if there was going to be any notification on the sign or anything like that, to maybe go to a QR code or something where people would know that they have, that they park there during a stadium event.
we can discuss that with DOT to see if there's a way to add it to the signs. That their sign shop actually installs all the signs, and see if there's a way.
Well,
to do
if we
that.
do it that way, you have to keep the website current, or you have to go to the Orioles calendar, or I don't know. I'm just kind of brainstorming here on that.
Yeah, I know that ideas have been thrown around in the past, but that was even before QR codes and what could be
Right,
done
I'm
in
sure.
that respect. Do we have flip signs that go up and down, and then who's going to flip all those signs when there's
Oh,
a stadium
and
event and flip them back
when
up when there's not? And yeah,
Right, well,
so-
and when I came on, there was still one sign in Waverly that said no parking during a stadium event, even though the stadium hadn't been there for 30 years, so. But anyway, so I just wanted to throw that out there, and happy to follow up. Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you. She's got the magic touch.
Hit it.
Look, I parked on the immediate, the west side of Federal Hill, 10 years ago, and went over to the other side of Federal Hill to the Visionary Arts Museum. First of all, I don't know what the hell's going on with stadium events. I don't know what the sports schedule is in this town. I don't watch any of it. I don't care about any of it, basically. I had no idea that there was an Orioles game starting, in a half an hour. I parked for 15 minutes and went over to the Visionary Arts Museum and was towed because I didn't know it was a stadium event. How's anybody supposed to know, in that kind of circumstance?
Well, take a look at the sign, see that it says stadium event, find out
Yeah,
if there's
but
an
this is
Orioles
the-
or a
but
Ravens
this is-
game
this
that
is-
day.
This is my
Yeah,
point.
So,
I don't know when it's a stadium event, and I'm going to a museum, that's a half a mile away from the stadium.
Yeah, but if you, I wish you lived within walking distance of one of the stadia. First off, parking at AVAM, you're not in an RPP area.
Like I said, I parked on the immediate west side of Federal Hill, literally directly next to the park. I walked
It's
around
an
the park.
RPP area.
Yeah, no, it was a stadium event parking.
Yeah, Area 9. I mean, there's 81 home games per year. They play baseball in the summer. There's 8 NFL home games plus 2 preseason every other year. There's 1.
And I want to go to a museum 365 days a year, my friend.
You should do that. I mean, that's positive. There's an incredible burden that residents who live adjacent to
We're
a
not saying we
state.
shouldn't have them. We should absolutely have them. We're just
No, we
saying
shouldn't.
there should be a,
I'm not
well,
saying
no,
that.
I'm a big fan of RPP.
Well, how
But
would, okay, so
I think there
how
should
would
just
we
be an
propose informing residents who are driving within one of the 6 RPP areas that there is a stadium event?
I'm just speaking to your point, Mr. Chair, that it's hard to be in an RPP, a stadium event area on a day that there's a stadium event happening and not know that there's a stadium event happening. It's perfectly logical to be able to, I went to a stadium, to an area on a stadium event day 15 minutes before there was a stadium event happening, so there was no sign of a stadium event happening anywhere. And I walked away from my car, and the stadium event was enacted while I was away from my car for a half an hour, and it got towed. So it's perfectly possible for a person to go into a stadium area and park their car and then have it towed without knowing that a stadium event was happening. It's perfectly possible.
I'll follow up.
That's all.
I'll follow up with you on that, just for the
Yeah.
signage.
I mean, to answer your question, though, yeah, we can explore with DOT other ways to, I know they put out the regular emails, press releases for stadium events or other events around the city, too, and so, but we can explore other ways to get it out there more. Sure?
I mean, one thing that would be helpful is clarification from DOT on what they classify as a stadium event, because depending on who the chief of parking enforcement has been, that number has varied anywhere between 15,000 and 20,000. Now, as a rule of thumb, like my neighbors know that if you're gonna have a visitor, they need to have a visitor's pass, otherwise they don't risk it, even if the Orioles are playing, 4 years ago when the Orioles were horrible, we're playing the Blue Jays at 1:35 on a Monday afternoon and no one's going to the game because it's raining out. Still, the people that live in the immediate area know you don't risk it. It's insane to risk it. It's what, $252 citation plus tow. I mean, you're talking damn near $1,000 before all that's over with. So, anyway, I digress. Any other questions for our friends from Parking Authority of Baltimore City? Was that? What do you want to talk about? No, go ahead, say it. You said it. Oh, okay. Well, joke taken. Pete, thank you very, very much. Please tell Mr. Rhodes I said hello.
I will.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much.
All right, we're in recess until BOPA, which I think they're outside.